There are 5 workshops in the Writing at the Graduate Levels series. Each of these workshops includes a Blackboard component. If you decide to complete the Blackboard component, you will be eligible after all 5 for a Writing at the Graduate Levels certificate. As you go along in this workshop, we have several moments in which we have reflections and questions for you to work on. It may be useful to keep out a pad of paper or an open Word document, as some of these reflections are actually part of the Blackboard activities. So, in the last workshop, we talked about the transition to grad school and some of the differences between undergraduate writing and expectations and graduate level writing and expectations. And one of the things we commented on, is that you're contributing to knowledge in the field, which meant you can't just summarize your sources anymore. This may have left you wondering, what exactly does this mean? How can I do it? And that's where this workshop starts off. So we're going to talk about the role of sources in graduate level work. We're going to go through some techniques that may help you read more efficiently and get through the articles. We're going to move into paraphrasing. So how can you write? How can you describe? And we're going to end off with this idea of citation, perhaps some mistakes, or at least where you can follow up to learn about the citation style that's used in your discipline. So what's so different about using sources in graduate level work? Well, one of the things is we can't be a sort of pick and choose the way we might have gotten away with at the undergraduate level. We have to talk about the field, and when talking about the field, we have to include the works that agree and the works that disagree with what we're trying to do. There's a conversation going on, and you can't just refuse to talk to one of the people in the conversation. Also, we use sources not as basically sort of little packages of data or facts, but rather looking at, how these sources inform what we will be doing. Do they tell us about our future project? Do they aid at the theoretical level, the methodological level? Is it very subject specific? And when we go and talk and use these ones, we have to develop that sense of conversation. We have to create the relationships between these various sources and how they present a field. So often we use sources at the graduate level to talk about there being a gap in the research, Something's not covered that we want to talk about. We might talk about the relationship between two fields that seem distinct and separate, but that we see as relating to each other, and that by having them talk to each other, that in fact we're going to get a sense of something that's new. We may create a new fruitful dialogue. So keep this in mind, that a lot of what happens with the uses of sources at the graduate level ends up being this role of coordinating, making meaning from the combination of texts, rather than perhaps picking and choosing certain details or facts that support our particular arguments. You're going to have to deal with the opposition a lot more in graduate school than perhaps you've done at the undergraduate level. Basically, the fundamental of previewing a text, the key kind of idea here is that we get a sense of the structure of the overall text before we jump in and start investing time reading the whole article, or perhaps in terms of research before we print the whole article. So one of the first steps, and I'm sure most of you already do this, is to look at the title. But rather than looking at the title sort of just to get a sense of what's going on, look at it in terms of keywords, particular terminology, phrases, titles of fields. What does this cue for you? How does that give you a sense of how it will relate to your work, or how it may relate to the topic of the class? Then from there, go to the abstract. The abstract, I'm sure many of you know, this invaluable summary of information. And the one thing that I also want you to keep in mind with the abstract is, often the abstract reflects the organization of the whole paper. So, if something is in the abstract and it's towards the latter end, often that means it's going to be in the latter end of the paper. Similarly, if they set up this whole context in their abstract and that's what you're interested in, look at that section in the paper. So in this way we can be more strategic. We can get the abstract as our map and now we know where to look. Another idea to do with previewing, particularly if you're trying to preview material for a class, is to actually look at the topic sentences of the document. Topic sentences tend to be the first sentence of a paragraph. And if it is a strong paper, you should be able to read the topic sentence for each paragraph and have a sense of what's going on. You may not have all the nuances, you may not have all the details, but you should be able to follow the general author's main points, the author's main argument, just by reading the first line of every paragraph. Then, having going through the whole argument, then you may choose to go back to certain paragraphs and read it all the way through. Unfortunately, books don't come with abstracts, but they do come with introductions and conclusions. And in fact, if you're going to read any chapters of a non-edited book, these are the places to go to. Why? Because, first of all, they include the key information. This is where authors set out their contributions to knowledge, what they think that they did to contribute to their field. And also, there's a lot of repetition between the introduction and the conclusion. This repetition lets you know that this is key information. So consider looking at the introduction and conclusion as a way to get a picture of the overall book. And this can even work at articles if there's substantial introductions and conclusions. Lastly, probably the most valuable section of any academic document: the bibliography or the work cited. Why? Because here is basically someone else's research. What did they read? What did they draw on? So, as you're building your own research, comparing bibliographies, looking at who is repeated, look at who they cite in those sections that were really relevant to you. If you read 3 paragraphs of this document to start off, who was cited in those 3 paragraphs? Chances are, out of all the people they list, these are going to be the sources that you want to follow up on and read as well. So by tracking bibliographies, by looking at them, quite frankly, that's the first place I go now. I look at the bibliography of the article before I read the abstract, because it lets me know, what kind of sources are they using? People are only as good as kind of the ingredients, right, that their paper is made of. So I look at the sources, I say, okay, which ones am I familiar with? And this allows me to develop a sense of the field as I go along and as I read. So that's great. I told you all about the principles of previewing a text. Now, let's see if you can apply them. On the handout and in the following slide, you're given a part of a journal article. What can you learn just from previewing the text? Keep in mind that you might want to keep these notes around, as they could be useful when answering the Blackboard component of the workshop. So, let's try this out. Let's see if this has ever happened to you. Using a highlighter, you're going along, and all of a sudden you seem to have highlighted the entire paragraph. Yeah. That's because highlighting is a very passive form of reading, and sometimes we can just get into that act of moving the highlighter rather than really engaging with the work. This is why I actually focus on annotation. Annotation requires you to have this active dialogue with what you're doing. And strong annotation doesn't just focus on circling key words, but actually includes these kind of on-the-margin comments in which you rephrase things in a way that you understand it. You add your own headings, And there are two really key benefits to annotating. One is that often your margin comments, or where you sort of step back and say, okay, I think the author is arguing X, that's a starting point for paraphrasing the material. You've already translated it into your own words, and now you can build it by molding it to fit into other work. The same point, you may find that in the long run, you're sitting in class, people are talking about this article. Well, if you've got highlighting, you have to reread everything that's highlighted to figure out why you highlighted it. If you have annotations, you can just go back, reread your own annotations, and you don't have to reread that whole section of text. So in this way, annotation allows you to be much more active, and it becomes a much more useful resource to go back to, right? If you have to go back to this article, now you know what you thought about the article, how it made sense to you. So annotation is very similar to in workshop 1 when we talked about tracking your sources. So a couple key tips to annotating your own sources is part of the annotation is to reflect yourself. Reflects what you knew beforehand, maybe your assumptions or associations with the topic. So don't leave these out of the annotation. If you have a project in mind, have your annotations include where you think that these could apply to your project. Focus on the aspects that match the task, that seem like they're going to fit with your work, rather than trying to read for overall comprehension. If you're looking at an article for its methodology and how that may be useful to you, you might not need to read their entire theoretical framework in such detail. Similarly, you have some critical thinking skills. You're able to make judgment calls. So when going through an article, you may want to focus on the areas that you find really rich, rather than trying to focus on understanding every bit of the article. And probably one of the most useful things you can do for yourself is to take time out of your annotation and write down the definitions of keywords as you understand them. So write down on the back of the piece of paper the idea of your own words. This will help. And don't think that annotation, though we've discussed it a lot in terms of writing in the margins, does not solely have to be done by hand on a printed copy. There are lots of options now in PDF software that allow you to add little bubbles, right? They've been allowing you to highlight for a while. So you can add little text notes. You can use a little pencil to make a circle on it. So even in digital form, you can still do this practice of annotation. One way to know that this process of annotation isn't working is if you're annotating everything. Remember, you want to look for abstractions, broad, portable ideas that could work for your project. Don't get bogged down in the details. These are percentages, numbers. Often, they're not as useful, though they can be really attractive. So, if you're making a lot of annotations, one thing you might want to ask yourself is, am I annotating the large, important concepts, or have I been annotating a whole bunch of details? So, once again, let's try out annotating. Why? Well, it's great to talk about these things in really broad ways, but let's see what you can find out looking at this particular article. Remember, keep your notes, because chances are they'll be helpful when you do the Blackboard component. One of the key things that shapes how you're interacting with your sources at the graduate level is that you want to make a critical intervention. However, often the word critical is associated with bad, negative comments, Oh, my mom's so critical about my clothing, meaning your mom doesn't like your clothing. Here, on the other hand, critical, in terms of critical thinking, really is talking about evaluation, organization, and engagement. So when you have a critical intervention into the field, into the literature that's there, really what you're saying is, I'm going in, I'm evaluating, I'm creating criteria, and that way I'm going to make judgments in the end. I'm going to end up staking, where do I sit? If there's this huge sort of discussion going on, who am I going to sit beside? So great, you want to do a critical intervention. How do you go about reading effectively for that? Well, in the next series of slides, I'm going to give you some of my key tips for working and building a critical intervention. And the first one, yeah, probably figured it out already, right? Don't use a highlighter. Use a form of engagement that allows you to have a dialogue with the texts. And this way you can say, I don't understand this. This seems to be in conflict with another article. Much more useful. So following up on this idea of not using the highlighter, you want to use your own words. You don't want to be writing down quotes from the article. Really, you want to set it up in how you understand it. Using your own words to describe parts of the article sets you up with a vocabulary and a possible structure for organizing and relating different sources together. So when we talk about the literature review in workshop 4, you're going to see that having your own notes, getting your own sense of how you see things relating, really sets up a really strong groundwork for writing a longer document in which you have to give a sense of how you see all of the field and key works relating together. Don't be afraid of terminology, unfamiliar words. Part of reading at the graduate level is learning this vocabulary so that you can use it properly and engage with it later on. So one way to figure out, okay, what are the key ideas, what are the abstractions in the article, is to locate, okay, what are the key words, key phrases that they tend to use to talk about this. In this way, if you can go identify the keywords, write down your own definition to them, you'll find that you're now already bridging and entering into your discipline. You now are starting to learn what these terms, terminology, jargon, whatever you want to call them, what they mean. And as you gather this knowledge, you're going to become a much stronger researcher because now you're going to know the key terms to pop in for that library search.
Okay, so as a master's student in education, I believe tips or tricks that I could relay to other people that are doing their masters would be on basically how to write or edit or research or essentially just get stuff done. What really works for me is that I know it may sound like a slower process, but I always write out a hard copy on paper first when I'm doing a draft of a paper. Because I find that when I transfer it over in Word, I really am catching a lot of my mistakes. I'm getting to edit and reword, and I'm also proofreading as well. So I find writing the hard copy first and then walking away from it and leaving it alone for a day if I can and if I have the time, and then going back to it. And when I start writing it in Word, things really do come together. So as archaic and as barbaric as writing it out with a pencil and a piece of paper, that's what I do. And I get out of the house and I go to a library. I take myself out of my comfort zone because if I don't, I would never get anything done. So I pick the nearest library and I go there, and it has worked for me because I've actually passed in things on time. And research is probably the most tedious part for me, and it's probably one of the most unliked components of my master's. But what I typically do is that really relates to getting myself out of my comfort zone and being in an area where it's conducive to do the research. But I usually try and do small chunks at a time. So those are things that have pretty much brought me almost to the end of my master's, which I'll be soon finished. So it's work.
And if active reading, being able to search more effectively, if that wasn't enough of a bonus for you, really by engaging with the work this way and reading, you're going to set up the groundwork for your daily writing exercise, for basically anything you want to do with that document later. Doing a little writing while you're reading can save you a lot of time, stress, cognitive load when you go to write. Why? Because all of a sudden, instead of reading and then trying to write something about it, you can look at your own notes using your own words, and you might just find that having all this pre-writing done, that in fact, it makes it a lot easier when you sit down to write. Heck, part of the work's already done for you. Because plagiarism tends to get everyone a little tense, I'm going to keep this cute raccoon on the screen because it's a much nicer image of being a thief or stealing words than perhaps having the word plagiarized spread out in bright colors all across the screen. Because fundamentally, most of people in graduate school aren't setting out to steal someone's words. In fact, I don't think many people go out and try to steal someone's words, but rather situations and contexts lead to lack of attribution and people incorporating the words of others into their own work without signaling to the reader that they're not theirs. So perhaps we're not looking at a thief-like raccoon, but we're looking at a very tired student. It's hard work being a graduate student, by all means. So, often if we're cutting and pasting from articles with the full intention of paraphrasing them, maybe at one point we messed up. We deleted the quotation mark that needed to be there. Unfortunately, being tired, not intending to plagiarize, but doing it anyways, you're still in trouble. In fact, it's not murder. We're not talking about the idea of that your intentions matter. Rather, we have to be really highly vigilant. So in this way, inadvertently plagiarizing doesn't really make a difference. So in fact, we need to be really careful. So I highly recommend not cutting and pasting from your text. It's really easy to forget that quotation mark. If you are, make it purple, make it bold, make it a completely different font, make it really hard for you to have them sneak in. And when you're editing, if it sounds like you're a genius, you're like, oh my God, give me the Nobel Prize. I could just submit this now and get my dissertation. Should just give me the PhD right now. This is genius. If you have that feeling, Google search it. Because chances are you've inadvertently plagiarized. As smart and brilliant as, all of us are, we're not quite to that level. So if you go and you're reading through and it's okay, and then genius, fortunately, chances are those words aren't yours. Typically, what we associate with plagiarism is this idea that we can't use the same words. Right? That we have to find different words. And actually, there are 3 things I want you to keep in mind when it comes to plagiarism. And same words is only one. Yes, you don't want to repeat the same words, but some words are fair game. If it is ventricular defibrillation, if that's the term, every time you use that term, do you have to put in quotation marks? No. Everybody shares that terminology. That's what it's called. So consider that terms, phrases that are now common amongst all sorts of articles. Yes, maybe one guy came up with the phrase sites of memory, but a lot of other people have used it. It's become a concept. That doesn't need to be in quotation marks constantly. But when dealing with new terms, new phrases or concepts, make sure that you understand what they mean, because nothing will jump out to a reader in your field as strongly and hurt your case as much as misusing particular terminology. So, don't repeat the words of your article unless they've reached this point of saturation. Because we're so focused on don't use the same words, that we often forget about this critical idea too. You can't use the same sentence structure. Why? Well, is it really your own work if you exchanged every word in a sentence with a synonym? Not really, right? The ownership, the construction of that sentence still belongs to the original author. So, when looking at paraphrasing, you want to make sure that you haven't just repeated the same structure. Did they start with malaria and you said, mosquito-driven disease? Probably not different enough. So keep in mind that if we're repeating the sentence structure, we're probably heading into some dicey water. We need to make our work more distinct from the original. So we had don't use the same words, don't use the same sentence structure, and don't put in the same order of ideas. Okay, you're probably a little confused here. Basically, think about it. You don't want to use the same set of examples. You don't want to have the same order of examples. You don't want to be presenting the information in a way that basically mirrors your original text. Did they start off with a context, experiment, examples? Did you keep that kind of pattern? Then basically, you may have just created an abridged version of the original, but one that is still locates its authorship, still owned by the original author. So we need to make sure that we're different enough from the original. And don't worry if you're feeling like this is overwhelming. Every time I go through these 3 key differences that are needed so that you don't plagiarize, most people have the sense that it is now impossible. They are never going to be able to write anything because everything they've ever written probably has included some plagiarism. Really, the key fundamental that we're going to talk about in strategies to avoid committing plagiarism and really paraphrasing strongly is fundamentally the level of the idea. If you are staring at a particular sentence, it's going to call to you. It's going to say, use my words, use my words. You might say, no, that's plagiarism. I can't use your words. Quote me. Right? Just save the time. Just put in me as a quote. Then you don't have to do all this work. Unfortunately, we can't do that every time we have a sentence that we're staring at. Otherwise, we're going to have all quotes and none of our own ideas. So we're going to look at some strategies that can actually set us up so that we don't hear that voice. The text isn't teasing us. So the first thing we're going to look at is at what point, at what level of knowledge are we trying to paraphrase? Rather than focusing on a particular sentence, think about when you're paraphrasing to try to look at the larger idea. What's being expressed in the document as a whole? What's being expressed in a paragraph? By focusing on a longer part of the text rather than a particular sentence, you're actually able to present the main idea, the gist, the little portable piece that works for you, rather than focusing on how do I rephrase this particular percentage. So consider one of the ways to be a stronger paraphraser is to actually think about the kind of idea. Am I paraphrasing an abstraction? That's more likely to be expressed in a page or a paragraph, and therefore it's going to be easier. And often I find people select particular details, not because they're really committed to having that detail present in the work, but because there's an argument they associate with that detail. So think about that argument, the concept, the main idea. And if we make that the target of our paraphrasing activity, we're going to be less likely to fall into that trap of wanting to repeat those same words, that same sentence structure, that same order of ideas. Chances are that you have a pretty good memory. You've made it to graduate school. So when you're looking to paraphrase something, don't look at the article. Probably the simplest thing I can suggest. Close that window, turn over the piece of paper, don't look. Why? Because whatever you remember, it's probably the information that you need to know, right? You can always write it and then look at it again and say, okay, does that match? But fundamentally, when we're looking at the article, it's calling to us much more loudly, right? You can hear it saying, you can see the words. All of a sudden, thinking of synonyms or other structure becomes harder. Why? Because you've inundated yourself with the original. So don't look at the original article, don't look at that section. Rather, step back, flip it over, and go with, what did you understand? What do you think it means? And 9 times out of 10, or even more likely, you've gotten it right. So don't look at the article. It's going to be a little bit hard, maybe unfamiliar at first, but not looking at the article will really help you become a strong paraphraser. Don't know where to start? Start with reporting expressions. What do I mean by reporting expressions? Basically, they're author-verb combinations. Holmes posits, Watson suggests, Moriarty schemes. All of these share basically the author-verb combination. What it does is it gets you to start your sentence by not focusing on the ideas, but attributing the ideas to a person. So if you don't know where to start your paraphrase by referring to the author of the work and a verb that really expresses in an active way what you feel is going on. And the great thing is, on your handout for this workshop, you're going to see a big, long list of verbs that you can use as reporting expressions. So if you find yourself in a rut, author's name, pick one from the list that seems to work for you, and then you can go on to your paraphrase, just by starting your sentence differently, right? Starting by even just understanding that there's an author, you are less likely to fall into that pattern of same words. Heck, you're not in the same sentence structure anymore, and chances are you won't have the same order of ideas. Reporting expressions. Really, really simple concept, but a big payoff.
When paraphrasing an author's ideas, I find the easiest thing to do is to write it backwards, to pull out the most important piece of information, the part that's most relevant to my own work, and just use the rest for supporting documentation. But when I'm doing this, I need to take care that I do not obscure or obfuscate the meaning of the sentence.
So the last thing to keep in mind is that any paraphrase is supposed to suit your context, the piece of work you're putting it in, and that's going to be distinctly different than the original. Because we want it to fit into our own work, our own projects, this is where we can build some distance from the original. Remember, we don't want to be tossing in quotations. Quotations are kind of like putting a wall up in the middle of your paper. To help the reader surmount this big obstacle, you have to build them a path by introducing the quote. At the same time, right, you have to help us get back down. So you have to explain it, which usually means that for every line of quotation you're putting in, you're probably writing 2 lines to set, one to set it up, one to explain it. Paraphrasing becomes much more efficient then, right? If you're going to spend all that time, why not spend at the beginning and create that perfect piece that fits into your project, right? We want it to be like the puzzle piece, a perfect match. So let's take a moment and read through the following quote. See what you understand from it, and then we're going to see how you like the paraphrases that are in the square in the right-hand corner. So if you sent our student here who wrote this work to the dean's office, good call. Yep, both paraphrases are examples of plagiarism. In both cases, we can see that we've basically taken the exact same words of the article and just pasted them together in slightly different ways. So let's look at the first one. You can see distance learning is repeated. we have the same idea of targets of fraud. We had fraud rings. You can also see straw students and federal financial aid, just copied and pasted there. When we look at the second one, we can see a similar pattern, right? We can say that low price, low cost, very similar. Okay, rarely show up to campus with this idea of anonymity. Groups can enroll. Well, basically, that last list is almost exactly like it is in the original. So, far too many cases of same words. So here we have another example using the exact same original text. We're going to offer you now 3 paraphrases. As you take a look at them, ask yourself, do these use the same words? Do they use the same sentence structure? Do they have the same order of ideas? Keep this in mind, because one of these paraphrases won't send you to the dean's office. One of them isn't plagiarism, and 2 options are. So take a look and see, can you figure it out? So why does this last possible paraphrase not fall into the traps of other ones? Firstly, we start with the idea that was at the bottom of our selection. We start with the incentive, right? The double costs. Then we talk about the criminal organizations, and then we go into enrolling in online education programs. So in terms of a structural point of view, we're reverse, right? We're starting off with what's at the end rather than what's at the beginning. We're careful not to repeat any of the language beyond particular terms. Fraud and fraudulent. Well, fraud is a particular term, it's a legal term, so we're allowed to use it. This is different than perhaps boring things like straw student. Okay? Federal financial aid. We don't want to borrow those, but we can borrow the idea of fraud because that's a common terminology. So think about these strategies when you're doing your own paraphrasing. We looked at, rather than one part of our quotation, the whole thing, and we tried to avoid the structure by starting with what is probably the most important piece of information. Why are they doing this? Because they can get tuition and living costs. So now that we've kind of outlined the 3 things you really want to consider to ensure that your paraphrasing isn't plagiarism, think about some of the tips. Reading for the bigger ideas, not looking at the paper, and try to apply them when you look at the following passage. Remember that your paraphrase for the passage below might be a good idea to keep that piece of paper handy when you go to the Blackboard activities. So now that hopefully you've mastered the art of paraphrasing, you may be thinking about citations. Where do I put them? How do I deal with this? Now, because the rules vary depending on discipline. If you're studying English, you may want to use NLA. If you're engineering, you may have a version of IEEE. So it's really hard to kind of address all of these things in a workshop. But there are places you can go. The wonderful librarians at the Taylor Family Digital Library can offer you all sorts of assistance if you want to use some sort of citation software. So if you're interested in RefWorks, Mendeley, Zotero, there's a place to go and get information on how technology can help you do your citations. But as great as technology is, right, we don't let computers write our papers. So you still need to know the rules for your particular citation style. So you have 2 options. You can go and book one of your 2 30-minute appointments a week, find out about the citation style, go through, do some examples that relate to your own work with a tutor, or check out and see when we run our in-person workshops on various styles. Either way, You'll be able to get the information that you need on your citation style and in the context of how it works for your discipline.